Good afternoon, folks, and welcome back to the show, the Grace C.C. Boone podcast. And I've got some exciting news for everybody. I think we've landed on a name for the podcast.
Oh yeah, what's the name?
Here it is. Tool Time.
Tool Time.
Tool Time, giving you the tools you need to live the Christian life. And if you want to increase the alliteration, Tool Time with Tim Trudeau.
Tool Time with Tim Trudeau. Okay.
That's 4 T's. All
There
right.
you go.
So welcome to the first official episode of Tool Time, folks. And we're going to start it off with a series. What's the series, Tim?
It's a series on the study of the different genres of Scripture. Fancy word.
Genres is a fancy word. The concept isn't nearly as fancy, but it is quite important.
Yeah, genre is simply the French word for literary form. It means that the Bible is written in different types of literature.
Okay, different types of literature. Leave it to the Frenchmen to know the word, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about genres, the different literary forms of the Bible. So why is genre important, Tim?
Well, if you go to the library and you want a certain kind of book, you know that the library is divided by section. If you want history, you go to the history section. If you want fiction, if you want a cookbook, if you want to learn how to repair a 1987 Ford Mustang, depending on what you want to do, biography, you go to a different section for the different book. And so the Bible's the same way. It's divided up into different kinds of literature, and you can't approach all books of the Bible the same way any more than you could just mix auto mechanics with poetry, with fiction, with biography. They're all different sections.
Right, and we kind of intuitively read those different kinds of books differently. However, a lot of people, when they come to the Bible, they'll use more or less one strategy for reading the scriptures, even though it's this anthology or compilation of different kinds of genres. So that's, I guess, what we're kind of trying to correct here, isn't it? Is this idea that you can't use the same method with every section of scripture. You need to adjust your interpretation method by what it is that you're reading.
Yeah, if I'm going to write a Valentine's card to my wife, it better read more like poetry than like a cookbook or a how-to book.
Or an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Your hair is this color.
Right.
This is how you smell when you wake up in the morning.
Yeah.
These kinds of things.
Yeah.
It's not going to be nearly as effective as something more poetic, something a little bit more artfully constructed, right?
Right.
So let's do this for this intro episode. What are the basic categories of genre that we're going to be approaching in the scriptures?
Yeah, that's a good question. And almost anybody you ask is going to break this up differently. So there's this is the formula. Last week, because I knew we were going to do this, I just looked at a few different books on my shelf where they tried to lay out the different genres. None of them was the same.
All different.
Yeah. All had a different number of genres and broke it up differently. So it's a little fluid. In fact, in men's Bible study, every week we ask, what genre is this? And everyone's afraid to answer because they might get,
right.
Because it's not always entirely clear what genre we're in. And that's partly true because even within a particular book that's one genre, you might have, for example, even in the epistles, you have some hymns that are taken and put right into Scripture as Scripture, but you read that hymn a little differently than you might read the rest of Philippians. Or the introduction is a particular pattern that follows typical first century introductions to letters. And so that makes it a little distinct when you're in the introduction to an epistle. So it depends on how far you want to break that down. But I've got 8.
Okay. 8 of them.
Yeah. exposition is the easiest and the one that most people think of when they think of the scriptures. That's like the Pauline epistles are exposition or didactic. There are a lot of imperatives, tells you how to do things, very clear, specific, straightforward, and it's the easiest. That's why people love Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians.
Right.
Because it's easy to read and understand, and you're not left questioning. What did he mean by that?
Right. Right. They're more. They read more like the kinds of essays that we would write in school. It's a more kind of Western form where it's developing an argument or a series of arguments that fits into the bigger one. And yeah, that's our comfort zone because that's how we write.
Yeah, it's Roman numeral 1 ABC.
Yep.
That's
easy to outline. Yeah.
Right. Narrative is maybe easy to understand. It's telling a story, and the Gospels are, for the most part, narrative text. They tell a story. Parables, well, it's pretty easy when you're in a narrative text in the Gospels. Well, if you come to a parable, that's a distinct type of literature you need to approach in a little different way. Poetry, Psalms, obviously, is the great poetic book in the Scriptures. Proverbs, well, that's Proverbs.
Yep.
A number of Old Testament books are prophecy.
Yeah.
And that's a particular type of literature that we'll talk about that requires some extra care in trying to discern and understand. Law is a big category of the Old Testament, particularly those books that when you're into Through the Bible in the Year reading plan, how to make sense of Leviticus and Numbers and those kinds of things. And then apocalyptic. It's we'll talk about what it is, but of course Revelation, for example, is apocalyptic literature, which is also a distinct literary form that requires a different kind of approach if we're going to understand it.
Sure. So I think that's a pretty solid breakdown, and I mean, like you were saying with the epistles, it just depends on how specific we want to be with our categories, because I mean, you could always break it down a little farther. Like you said, there's hymns, but there's just not that much of it in the scriptures. So for us to say this is, break it down into more categories, it would just take a lot longer. Probably not a podcast type endeavor.
No, that's a seminary class.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So here's a question for you, and I didn't prep Tim for this, so this is off the cuff. How do you recommend people figure out what genre it is that they're reading?
Well, you should have a list in front of you. I've developed this simple 10-question approach to studying the scriptures. We'd be happy to email anybody that
for sure
worksheet, and just asking 10 questions of the text, one of which is, what genre is this? And then there's a little box off to the right that gives you all the options, and then you just could circle and look at the options and decide which one it is and what that means for your text. But yeah, you should know the basic genres, have an idea. Usually, most people approach the scriptures, they're in a particular genre for a while.
Right.
It's not like you're jumping genres every time you open the Bible.
Right.
If you're reading through the Psalms, well, you're in poetry for weeks. If you're reading the Gospels, well, it's narrative text. So it's pretty easy once you are in a book to understand, okay, I've got to approach this whole book a certain way.
Yeah.
Then you don't have to ask that question again until you change books, usually.
Yeah. So developing a basic understanding of each of the genres, and then, like we said at the beginning, this isn't that fancy or technical. If you have a kind of ground level understanding of what each genre is, you'll be able to identify what it is that you're reading probably pretty quickly.
Sure. I mean, and these are things we're already familiar with. Everybody's read poetry. We understand what poetry is, and we already have some understanding of the basic principles of understanding poetry that we'll talk about.
Yeah. And then another thing that I would point out in one of our last episodes, we talked about the importance of having a good study Bible. In every book for the ESV study Bible, at least, that's the one I'm familiar with, in the introduction, one of the sections is genre or type of literature.
Oh, really? Great.
Yeah, and so they'll tell you what kind of literature it is, and usually it's a brief description of what that means for this book. So if you followed our advice last time and you have a good study Bible, a lot of times they'll point you in the right direction too. Anything else for this intro on genre, Tim?
No, just to not let it frighten you or like it's something overwhelming. We've got, at least by my count, 8 categories.
Yep.
And once you open a book and you start to read in that book, what's the category of this book? Apply certain principles as long as you're in that book. And then when you open another book, you ask the same question. And it's not overwhelming. It's just reformulating the way you look at every book has this literary skeleton upon which the words are hung. And the skeleton's a little different in each book, and you just have to ask yourself, okay, what is the form here in which these words are written, and what are the implications for my understanding? Right.
Yeah. So it's not scary, but it is important. And we'll end with this, an example of why a genre is so important. I'll put the exact references in the show notes, but there's a section in Proverbs where back to back there's 2 verses, and the first one says, basically, don't answer a fool in his folly, because then you'll be a fool too. So if someone's doing something foolish, let them do it. But then the very next verse says, if you don't answer a fool in his folly, then you're a fool as well. So they say exactly what seems to be the opposite things. And somebody who doesn't understand a proverb might look at that and say, well, I'm done with the Bible because there's this just blatant contradiction right next to each other. But a proverb is not meant to be, it's not like reading a natural law. It's not Newton's first law of motion. This is a general principle that the wise person will be able to apply rightly. So sometimes someone needs to learn their lesson, and so you just let the foolish person do his foolish thing so that they can learn from it and you don't get caught up in it. But other times, maybe when the cost is too high or the person is doesn't have the knowledge to learn the lesson from their foolishness, they'll need to be instructed by somebody else. So then you're in the wrong if you don't tell them what they're doing is foolish. So in that situation, understanding what exactly a proverb is essential to understanding what the author means. And it's like that really with every literary genre that we're going to approach. So that's our intro to genre, and now we're going to, for the next few episodes, dive into some specific genres. Should be exciting.
All right, great, thanks.
All right, thanks for tuning in to Tool Time with Tim Trudeau. We'll see you next episode.